14,000 years ago, the glacier that had buried New England under thousands of feet of ice for thousands of years receded. Forests did not survive under the glacier, but now could become reestablished across the land. The first European settlers arriving in the early 1600s found coastal forests of pitch pine and oak. As they moved inland along major rivers, they found primeval forests with trees that could withstand seasonal flooding, such as silver maples. There were basswoods and ashes, cottonwoods and American elms, grand ghostly sycamores, and gnarly old willows. They found trees of all sizes, from seedlings to aging monarchs. As the early settlers continued traveling the waterways to the uplands, they discovered great hardwood forests of white ash, sugar and red maples, beech, oaks, yellow, black, and paper birches, massive hickories, American chestnuts, and there were shady groves of magnificent ancient hemlocks. In deep soils of fertile river valleys, the eastern white pine rose tall and straight out of the ancient forest. It towered above all others. Dense woodlands with trees big and small, young and old. This was the primeval forest of New England. Or was it? Accounts from the early 1600s indicate that Native Americans regularly burned the understory of the coastal pitch pine forests. And in the river bottoms, where native populations were high, there's more evidence that they burned the understory, producing open, park-like forests to encourage the growth of berry-producing plants, to make travel and hunting with bow and arrow easier. Burning would tend to favor nut-producing trees, such as oaks, chestnuts, and hickories, whose thick bark could withstand the heat of fires.
There is the belief by many people that even if native people didn't actively clear the land, that they may have been using fire in more subtle ways within the forest to manage for species composition and structure. So for species, there may have been an interest in encouraging nut-bearing species like oaks and hickories, which would have produced food both for people and for a lot of wildlife. The notion that people were managing for particular species of tree is a great hypothesis that we would love to test, but it's just terribly difficult to find the evidence to either accept or to reject it.
So we know that some of the forest was likely manipulated by natives, but that probably only occurred along the coast and in river bottoms. It's doubtful that higher elevation forests were burned, and therefore were likely in their natural condition before settlers arrived. Settlers began the backbreaking work of clearing forest land for homesteads and small farms. Oxen and horse teams were often used to do the heavy hauling. Over the next century, the frontier forest slowly began to fall in front of axe-wielding men clearing pastures, hay fields, and crop fields for their self-sufficient way of life. In the 1650s, the lofty white pine started coming down in numbers to be made into ship masts for the British Navy. 3.5 decades later, A new law declared that all white pines 24 inches or more in diameter were reserved for the King's Navy. The pine had great value to the colonists for construction and furniture, so the law was despised and ignored by many who took the trees down in spite of the King's proclamation. The issue of who owned these pines was a factor leading up to the Revolutionary War. Around 1810, the pace of deforestation would skyrocket in central New England.
One of the really big impacts on the forests of central New England was sheep fever. And sheep fever was a fairly short period. It went from about 1810 to about 1845. The fever was a wool-growing mania that spread through this region as this first sort of market farming opportunity. And there are three things that brought it about. The first, Napoleon going to war against Spain. The Spanish had developed a special breed of sheep called the Merino. And the Merino not only made a very ample fleece, but it made a wool that made woolen textiles that were not scratchy at all. They liberally exported the wool around the world, but they had an embargo on the sheep itself. They didn't want anyone to get a hold of that breed and become a competitor. With the war, they couldn't enforce the embargo, and our ambassador to Portugal at the time in 1810 was William Jarvis, and he was able to smuggle 4,000 Merino sheep out of Spain through Portugal to bring them back on his Vermont farm. 2 years after that, the War of 1812 put tariffs up on all imported woolens, giving anyone who could make woolens here a market advantage. And then 2 years after that, in 1814, the power loom was invented. And those three things kicked off sheep fever. And with the water power coming out of these central New England hills, it vaulted this region, become really one of the major woolen textile producing regions in the world. Now, to give you an idea how dramatic the landscape changes are that come with sheep fever, in 1810, when Jarvis brings over his first 4,000 Merinos, only about 20% of the central New England landscape below 2,000 feet is open agricultural land. But in the next 35 years, as those 4,000 Merino sheep swell to 6 million, the landscape becomes almost 80% deforested below 2,000 feet in this region, the bulk of it in pasturage for sheep. So over half the area of central New England was clear-cut to make way for sheep pasture. It was a dramatic imprint that's been left with all the stone fences we see in central New England today.
In a mere 3.5 decades, the New England sheep craze had gone bust. The once vast primeval forest had nearly completely fallen to hand tools and a few draft animals. Then in the mid-1800s, farmers began to give up on their stony New England soil and headed west to the Ohio River Valley. By nature's whim, much of that open, abandoned land seeded in with white pine. In about 60 years, in the early 1900s, those trees had grown enough for the timber industry to take another run at logging the white pine. That was an opportunity for hardwood trees to replace much of that second growth pine.
One of the important consequences of that pattern of land clearance is, I think, that it strongly skews our understanding of old-growth forests, right? Because so much of the truly productive land, the land that probably would have grown some of the biggest trees and magnificent old-growth forests, was also the most desirable for agriculture. So these would be bottomlands. These would be gentle slopes with deep soils. Those were all cleared. But the forests that were left were not left alone. And so they were cut, and especially in the 19th century into the early 20th century, cut incredibly intensively. So that few areas of true old growth remained into the 20th century.
Many abandoned farms, fields, and pastures have reverted to forest in New England, but today's woodlands are not old growth. Most have been repeatedly cut to different degrees, Privately owned forests tend to be harvested more often than publicly owned lands and are generally less than about 70 years old, whereas state-owned may be up to 120 years old. Over 40 years ago, when there was little thought of seeing truly old forests in the Bay State, a newcomer to western Massachusetts began finding what he recognized as old-growth characteristics. His name is Bob Leverett, and his discoveries have surprised a lot of people.
I've sometimes been asked, how did I get started in hunting old-growth forests in Massachusetts? And it goes back into the middle 1970s. My son Rob and I were out actually looking for big white pines. And we started seeing places that just had a much older look. And that started the whole ball rolling. My son and I walked into the Coal River old-growth area, which had been recognized by the Society of American Foresters. We stalked into an area, and my eyes nearly popped out. What I was seeing were characteristics that were common to me that I had grown up with in the Smoky Mountain region, where there's a lot of old growth. All the components were there. I realized at that point in time that we probably had some real bona fide old growth forest. And I realized then that we had seen places that had similar characteristics to that elsewhere in the state forest of Massachusetts. There came a point when I thought that I needed to find out whether what we were thinking was old growth forest was, and I wrote an article published, I think it was April 1988. And after that, my phone started ringing off the hook. I teamed up with some scientist friends at Harvard Forest Research Center and a couple of people from University of Massachusetts and Mass Audubon, Dr. Peter Dunwoody notably, and we started exploring these old-growth patches that I thought I was identifying, and that's where the formal studies began.
I think it was about 1985 when I first got a call from Bob Leverett asking me to come out to western Massachusetts to take a look at what he thought was old growth and some big trees. My first reaction was that, well, that's kind of strange. Massachusetts has been inhabited by Europeans cutting down trees for over 300 years, and it was hard for me to believe that there was still any old growth left to be found. But Bob was a hard person to say no to. His enthusiasm was pretty infectious. So off I went to the Berkshires. Bob took me around to a number of sites in the Berkshires, and right away I knew he was onto something. There were just stands of trees that just didn't look like anything else that I'd seen, and based on a little experience I've had with old growth in other parts of the United States, there seemed to be something pretty unusual about these trees. We confirmed this with some cores that we took, and sure enough, there were stands of trees that surprisingly were well in excess of 200 years old. Some of them were really big, and some of them were really old. And pretty quickly, I began to realize that there was a lot out there in the woods that had gone unnoticed. It's surprising how all these patches of old growth went unnoticed for so long. Part of it, I suppose, was just figuring out what to look for, having the right search image. Sometimes the stands of old hemlock simply aren't all that impressively tall or big around. Other times, the trees were pretty much right there in plain sight, but no one had thought to ask that simple question. Were these guys growing here before the Pilgrims set foot on the Massachusetts shore? If you don't really think there's something out there in the first place, like old-growth forest, sometimes it never occurs to you to even ask the question.
From that early work, we did a study for the Endangered Species Program and identified areas of old-growth forest in the midst of finding more. And eventually, through the efforts of Dr. Tony D'Amato at the University of Massachusetts, we ended up with about 1,200 acres identified of old-growth forests on both public and private lands in Massachusetts.
In 2000, I was a summer student working with Dave Orwig at the Harvard Forest. And as the summer went on, he finally opened up his drawer in his desk and showed me these maps that Bob Leverett had drawn of potential old growth areas in western Massachusetts. And I was about to leave for grad school out west, but he said, you know, when you finish grad school, if you're ever interested in coming back here, you could be the one that works on these old growth areas. And so I'm pretty a spontaneous person. That's exactly what I did. And so in 2002, started working with those maps that Bob had spent many years developing along with Peter Dunwoody and others. Across all the old growth areas in western Massachusetts, we collected over 3,000 increment cores from these trees. So looking at these old growth areas, you know, there's a lot of variety in terms of the age structure. Generally, we think of them as uneven age, so there's a diversity of age classes, a few very old trees to some middle-aged trees to a lot of young-aged trees. And so even though we often think of old growth as these kind of pristine, almost static areas, they're very dynamic. A lot is happening, and disturbance is a very important part of shaping how these look today. Depending on where you are in Massachusetts, 80 to 90% of the landscape was in an old growth forest condition at the time of European settlement. But generally, old growth was really the defining forest condition across Massachusetts. Today, it's 1/10% of Massachusetts forests are old growth, so it's an extremely rare resource. So even though Massachusetts has over 60% forest, a large proportion of that is highly altered from what it used to be like naturally. These forests really tended to have species that could live for a long time, things like hemlock that can live to be even 600 years old, beech as well, sugar maple depending on the richness of the site, and then sometimes a minor component of white pine.
Most of the remnant old-growth forest is in steep, mountainous terrain. Often it's found on rugged sites, strewn with large boulders dragged there by the glaciers. That is likely what saved these trees from the saw and axe. What man would risk breaking his or his draft animal's legs up there in those conditions? But we're fortunate to have this sort of terrain. Without it, we certainly have no old-growth forest remnants left. And surprisingly, we still occasionally discover previously unrecognized patches of old-growth forest here.
Those that have been found are largely in those places that were both less profitable or productive for other purposes, and oftentimes extremely inaccessible.
So, how can we recognize old-growth forests in central New England? In an old deciduous forest, the canopy is generally dense. A continuum of tree ages creates a multi-layered structure. A thick blanket of duff carpets the forest floor. The dense canopy and duff layer help to retain moisture, creating the conditions for growth of a lush plant community. Wildflowers and other ground-level plants are often more abundant. Hobblebush is one of the plants often found in these old forests. The moist forest floor in these shaded woods supports luxuriant growths of ferns. Even the ancient boulders are often capped with gardens of rock polypody and other ferns.
In addition to the great ages that these old-growth forests have, they're also a rich source of biodiversity on the landscape, from unique and different wildlife habitat to the bryophytes that are found on the trees and the ground, to the insect life that is contained within these forests.
The centuries have laid down thick beds of mosses and other bryophytes. Lichens cover the tree trunks and rocks. Some of these sites have a tropical jungle feel. Moisture-loving yellow birches cast their long roots across the damp rocks. One of the hallmarks of an old forest is the uneven ages of the trees present. Both the ages and the sizes of the trees vary from one end of the spectrum to another. Not all large trees are old, and not all old trees are large. This black birch tree, a mere 6 inches in diameter, is already 100 years old. As a young tree ages and grows, its smooth bark is stretched and cracked, becoming thicker, more scaly, and deeply furrowed. Eventually, the bark of the old tree may not resemble its youthful bark at all. These second-growth red oaks are about 100 years old. At 200 years old, they'll look like this, and at 300, more like this. Younger hemlock bark has thin scales. At 300 years, the bark plates are much thicker and darker.
So I think people, if they were walking through this forest, would probably sense visually it looks different than the regular forest. They'd start to capture I think, maybe the sizes of trees, maybe the coarseness of the bark. But there's a lot about these forests that we can't see. A lot of us judge, let's say, the diversity of a forest by what we see above ground. How many different plants, how many different types of bird species, things like that. When in fact, the bulk of the biota and the species is down in the ground. We're just sort of in our infancy of really understanding these forest soil communities because they're way more complex than we understood, and there's a myriad of interactions going on there. So a lot of the biotic diversity in old growth forests like this is not above ground, it's below ground, as well as the bulk of the carbon that we see out here is below ground. So this old growth hemlock here, there's a lot of carbon stored in its trunk. There's a lot of carbon in the trunks of the trees around us. But once one of our forests in this region gets to about 80 years of age, half of the carbon is down in the soil. And as these forests age, more and more of the carbon is down below ground than above ground. So these old growth forests are really important carbon sinks, taking up a lot of carbon and putting it down into the ground, where then it can support these incredibly diverse soil communities. People walking through this forest would probably have a different feel and maybe not know exactly why. One thing, if they stepped off trail, they would feel it right away. The ground is really squishy, and that's from all the carbon that's down here. So that's one thing that people can notice right away. Younger forests don't have the squishy soils of an old growth forest.
This is a 50-year-old second-growth forest. The crowns of these trees are bushy with many twigs. These trees have not yet had time to develop heavy limbs in their crowns. They have a wispy look. Contrast those with an old sugar maple that's had time to develop its crown. Or with this huge, state champion black cherry tree. These trees don't have the round, symmetrical, bushy tops of younger trees. This is a characteristic of old trees that, over the centuries, have been pruned back by storms and wind. One tree species has a unique relationship with wind. It grows in thick swamps, amid dense mountain laurel and other shrubs. This is the longest-lived deciduous species in the eastern forest. When old, it has very rugged, thick, blocky bark. This is the king of gnarly-crowned, storm-battered trees. This is the black gum or tupelo tree. These are some of the oldest living trees in New England. Ring counted to well over 500 years in this swamp. They were spared only because their wood had low commercial value, and the landowner appreciates their beauty and ecological value. Some have commented that they almost expect to see dinosaurs roaming this swamp.
This black gum is a lot more highly evolved as a swamp tree than our other sort of regional swamp trees. The reason is that it has a lot of wind-related adaptations. The worst thing for a swamp tree is to be hit by wind and taken down. And so what the black gum does, if it gets hit by a gust of wind, it's going to snap off somewhere in its trunk. And then it very vigorously buds back out new limbs at that breakage point. So this black gum right here, if you follow it up, you're going to see all these elbows. Each one represents a breakage point, but it remains standing. And those wind events would take our other regional swamp trees right down. And that's why the black gum can persist here and reach great age because of this adaptation. And they naturally hollow out as well, making them excellent trees for honeybees. They can nest within them. Very, very dramatic trees. They have a lot of character. This is a younger black gum right here I'm holding on to, and this is an old tree. But this bark is telling us just how ancient this tree is. I mean, you know, I can stick my hand in there a good ways in a lot of these crevices. And it's, you know, this is really, really coarse barked.
Shade-tolerant trees like beech, sugar maple, and hemlock can grow under the shade of their own or other species, so they eventually dominate the canopy and it becomes closed, excluding non-shade-tolerant species from the forest. Strong winds and storms literally shape our forests. These pines and hemlocks, constantly buffeted by north winds, have no limbs on their north sides. Over time, trees will be broken and blown down. Others will give way to decay. The toppling of these trees leaves holes in the once closed canopy. Now, sunlight can penetrate through the gaps to the forest floor, sparking new ground-level plant life, including new trees. These natural breaks in the canopy allow tree species that can't grow in shade to get a foothold in the forest. The random distribution of these gaps and the new growth that occurs within them is what makes an old-growth forest a patchwork of uneven-aged trees. Trees on the edges of the gap will expand their crowns into the available light. As a result, the ragged crowns of individual old trees are noticeable on a mountainside, with visible spaces between trees. A second growth site looks more smooth and even-textured. Individual trees are not easily discernible. Here, the difference can be clearly seen. Just as their roots pursue soil nutrients and water, tree crowns will seek the sunlight in a canopy gap, often resulting in sinuous or contorted growth. Blowdowns and other disruptions to the closed canopy provide opportunities for shorter-lived, shade-intolerant species to take hold, such as white ash, bitternut hickory, black cherry, paper birch, white pine, and this big-tooth aspen. These species have a proper place in an old-growth forest, adding to and benefiting the diversity of all life forms there.
We identified several areas that were just simply outstanding. It sort of fit the archetypal old-growth image that many people had of big trees, tall trees, old trees. But we also found areas that were not particularly outstanding in those features. And so we started to fully appreciate the wide range and complex nature of old-growth forest ecosystems and understand that disturbance plays out in many forms and leaves its imprint in many ways. It wasn't just about big trees.
By being able to focus on old forests, the information contained in those trees allows us to examine how those forests developed, what type of structure occurs over time, and we can then compare that with the second growth forests. And what we find is that the structure is usually quite different. We have a much more multi-layered canopy in old growth forests. We have a much larger range of diameters in old growth forests versus second growth forests. And we have a lot of other characteristics like standing dead trees and down dead material that's much higher in old growth forests as compared to our second growth forests.
Fallen trees, limbs, and leaves decompose over time and build soil, recycling their nutrients. Most hardwood logs rot away and disappear in a few decades, like this beech. Hemlock logs are a little different. Because of their high tannin content, they can persist on the forest floor much longer than most hardwood logs. Eventually, they become blanketed with moss. At that point, they're ideal germination sites for ferns, but primarily for small seeded trees, such as yellow birch. When the tiny seeds of these birches germinate on the forest floor, they don't have enough stored energy to put down roots through the leaf and duff layer. So these nurse logs are essential for their survival. A wind-thrown tree will often pull up a root ball of soil, providing one other place for birches to germinate their seeds.
Dead wood is really a unique element of these old growth forests and a critical functional part of these systems. These areas are also really important refugia for species like seedlings. Actually, this log right here has a bunch of birch seedlings on it already. And even during a dry summer day, you can easily dig into a log like this and essentially squeeze out moisture quite readily. And so these logs are really important kind of micro refugia for organisms. So one thing that's really unique about old growth is by having all this dead wood, by having this history of trees toppling over, and then also having all these layers in the canopy, it creates a very unique microenvironment. And as a result, we often find a diversity of plants and fungi, small mammals, and other organisms taking advantage of all those unique niches that exist throughout that forest. This dead wood really has a critical function in the forest and always has, but as we think about environmental change, really is something that folks should be paying attention to. And these old growth areas provides a unique refugia by having large accumulations for things to rely on.
Large diameter hollow logs serve as hotels, restaurants, and nurseries to the animal world. They are almost non-existent in our modern-day forests. Old-growth forests may live on indefinitely, but not so individual trees. Eventually they come down. And when they do, there's a world of decomposers ready to take them apart. This hemlock stump is well on its way to becoming soil, but it's not done yet. A fungus has spread its mycelial threads all through the wood, slowly digesting it. The fungus will produce mushrooms to spread spores. In the meantime, the stump is home to rodents, slugs, amphibians, insects, and a host of other invertebrates. After many decades, the wood will be totally digested and returned to the soil. Not only do fungi decompose dead plant material, they also form a vast underground communication network among most plants and trees, and they substantially promote the growth of trees by tapping into water and mineral sources that they pass to the tree's roots, in exchange for sugars provided by the trees. Researchers are finding increasing evidence that the hidden network of fungal mycorrhizae in forest soil is much more important than once realized. These fungal networks connect tree and other plant roots together, allowing them to pass not only water and nutrients across the network, but chemical defense signals as well. An insect attack on one tree may be communicated through the network to other nearby trees, enabling them to produce defense chemicals in advance of the insect's arrival. What's more, interconnected trees are able to help each other grow and remain alive and healthier than a non-connected tree. These fungal networks are a vital link within a forest. Disruption of these networks due to human activity is a setback for the forest, which may take many decades or even centuries to recover. There is as much or more activity happening out of sight in the duff layer as there is above ground in the treetops. The lady slipper orchid cannot reproduce and survive without a soil fungus to break open its seeds. The overall health of a forest is greatly dependent on an intact duff layer, with a vibrant fungal community an integral part of it. Some of the largest living organisms in the world are now known to be fungus mats covering thousands of acres. There are other forces working to take apart dead wood. Carpenter ants. They don't eat the wood, but they excavate nests within it. They in turn become food for a variety of animals, from woodpeckers to black bears. And a hole once excavated by a foraging woodpecker looking for ants is now a germination site for a red maple seed. In an old-growth New England setting, red maple has a very sparse presence, kept in check by competition and the ever-present canopy. In a highly disturbed setting, such as cleared land, red maple can dominate a site, reducing diversity. In an ancient woodland, it's just one of many magnificent forest tree species. If there's one tree species that's most emblematic of old-growth forest in New England, it's the eastern hemlock.
Hemlock forest we don't tend to think of as being a very rich forest type, having a lot of different species, but what we did find is when we looked at the understory plants in hemlock that was old growth compared to hemlock that was 100 to 110 years old and had developed following harvesting, is that there was very distinct differences, particularly in the abundance of certain species like wild sarsaparilla, hobblebush, in those old growth stands relative to these second growth stands. So those aren't necessarily rare species, but what it spoke to were there's a greater range of habitats in these sites, as well as kind of less intensive land use that allow those to persist and thrive in those areas. Ironically, that hemlock dominance now threatens that 1% of our landscape, given that hemlock woolly adelgid is now threatening these areas. And if we have hemlock woolly adelgid getting into some of these portions of the landscape, will totally change our last remaining old growth forests across the region.
Until the late 19th century, hemlocks were heavily exploited for their bark. Every town had one or more small tanneries which consumed the bark for its tannin content to be used in tanning leather. It was a wasteful practice. Bark was stripped from standing or felled trees, the remains of which were often left to rot in the woods. It's a familiar story. Only the least accessible hemlocks survive today as old growth. Hemlocks and boulders seem to be good company for each other. It's amazing how a tree perched on bare rock can remain standing. Sometimes they do need a bit of support.
We found a hemlock within the Mohawk Trail State Forest that was 488 years old, which now it's still alive, thankfully, so it's over 500 years old now. What was also interesting is in a lot of these hemlock stands, there was usually a very old black birch component, not very common, but certainly a part of that forest that was very commonly over 200 years old. We even had some black birch that were over 300 years old, which is at that time the oldest documented black birch for the eastern forest.
Finding black birches 200 and 300 years old was a big surprise. But of all the tree species in New England, it's the lofty white pine that takes the height records. Perhaps no one has more expertise in measuring them than Bob Leverett.
The anecdotal accounts from past writers suggest that white pines could reach heights of 250 feet and maybe diameters up to even 10 feet. We today regard these accounts as more or less the equivalent of big fish stories. In truth, white pines from the past could reach 200 feet, but very rarely. 180 feet, somewhat more commonly, and 150 feet quite often. A 4 to 5 foot diameter was often achieved, and that's basically what we find the trend of the biggest trees today reaching. As I think about the tree species in the East, perhaps none more so than the great white pines of New England and the Northeast inspire me more. They really capture the essence of old growth, of great stature, of great age, of lone giants rising above the canopy of hardwoods and saying out to the world, look at us, we're here, and we're the best of the best.
Winter snows become spring meltwater. These old woodlands soak up that water in the spongy duff layer, filtering it to the highest level of purity that nature can provide, moderating its flow, and eventually releasing it into free-running mountain streams. Much of the water is retained, creating the high moisture levels that perpetuate the mosses, lichens, and the entire forest itself. The processes that flow through these ancient forests occur on a timescale that we humans don't experience. We don't live for centuries rooted in one spot. These woodlands have evolved and adapted to the conditions in which they grow. In less than one tree's lifespan, we have radically altered those conditions, and not for the better. We all use and need forest products, but harvesting a forest must be done with great care and concern for the land, because it has negative effects. Logging a forest results in a simplification of its structure, reduces microhabitats and biological diversity and richness. Drying of the soil can occur, along with damage to the all-important duff layer. Increased light penetration and bare soils often open the door to non-native invasive species, further degrading the forest. Vines, such as this oriental bittersweet, thrive in the increased light. They climb, choke, and kill trees. Japanese knotweed obliterates everything under its dense foliage. Thorny multiflora rose must have been sent here by the devil himself. Glossy buckthorn will completely take over the understory of a forest. Burning bush or winged euonymus has penetrated many of our woodlands and forms impenetrable thickets. And a sea of thorny Japanese barberry will make you think twice about taking a walk through this woodland. Thankfully, most of our old-growth remnants have not yet been affected by invasive plants, but non-native insects and fungi are doing damage. In a natural, old-growth forest, nature maintains a balance. Competition prevents any one species from gaining a large advantage over all others, giving the forest the adaptability it needs to survive changing conditions over time.
There's a lot we still don't know about these old growth areas. Are there unique microbial communities? Are there unique fungal communities? What do we see in terms of differences in temperature and moisture across these forests that might actually help us understand how they may be impacted by climate change? What are the genetic makeup of these old trees that have been here for a long time and have proven they can withstand some dramatic fluctuations in climate? These trees are still here and persisting, so there are things we can learn from those trees.
One way scientists can learn more about our forests and climate is by extracting small cores from trees, allowing them to see and measure the annual growth rings under magnification.
And so we can see how a tree grew by how wide the ring is, or the amount of wood that's put down across the year. And here we have a very wide ring, and then we have a very long series of narrow rings that indicates, in this case, tree damage based on some past disturbance. And that's the value of looking at old trees, because they are a great recorder of information and past disturbance. And so we have a system here that we can then measure these annual growth rings and determine exactly when that disturbance occurred, and also how slow it grew and for how long that period of slow growth occurs. And we can use that across a variety of different trees to get some indication of the disturbance history of the forest.
So what can we learn from old growth forests that maybe we can't from second growth forest or 100-year-old forest? We're here at the Harvard Forest right now. This is the wired woods. All kinds of research is being done on this forest. Most of the trees are, the dominant trees are 110, 130 years old. We know that these forests are just getting started now at 100 years. People are surprised that the red oaks here are taking up more carbon than they had 25 years ago. And this was a surprise to many scientists. How the forest works up to this point, up to about 110, 115 years, we actually know this pretty well. What happens next? How do they change? In which directions do they go? Trees up in this part of the world grow annual rings each year, and we can count the rings to see how old the trees are. But our science is so much more than that. We can look at the patterns of large and small rings through time, and we can say, that's the 1774 frost event. But then there are other patterns in the rings that represent different things. We can identify ice storms. We can identify gypsy moth defoliation events. We can say, oh look, these trees reduced growth suddenly in this one year for 2 or 3 or 4 years and then slowly recovered. But these trees did the opposite. Tree rings in the eastern United States in the last 40 years or so, they've been used to reconstruct climate history, to understand how our climate has changed. My advisor found a black birch that's 360 years old. 2 summers ago, we cored a white ash, where they don't even have a maximum age in the Silvic Spaniel. We have one that's over 300 years old, and it grew really slow at first, and then it accelerated its growth rate over the course of its lifetime. As it got older, it grew faster. And when we go into old growth forests and we just start coring different species, like yellow birch, we learn things like they act or they grow differently than the other individual species around them, and even other individual yellow birches. And so there's just so much more basic natural history that we can learn from old growth forests using tree rings. This is the value of old growth forests. We can't learn this from the forests that have been cut.
There's something else that comes from our studies of old growth, and that is a recognition of what we're missing in the New England landscape. Largely what we're missing, the most obvious thing that we're missing, is structure. We're missing immense trees. We're missing immense standing dead trees that provide habitat and shelter for a range of organisms. We're missing mounds of dirt and adjoining pits that are created by the windfall of these big trees. When we get down into swamps and into streams, we're missing the effect of these big trees as they dam up the water flow and diversify the habitat of our water bodies, ranging from small streams to big rivers, ponds, and lake shores. All that's missing, and it's missing because our landscapes has been so heavily cut over and so heavily cleared, and we're so early in the recovery stage of that the kinds of conditions that you would find in an old-growth forest have been eliminated and have not yet redeveloped.
Given where we are today, I sometimes reflect back on where we started and something rather scary. The old growth that we have identified that we collectively want to protect, we almost lost that. That was not visible on radar scopes. And it wasn't visible because we had unrealistic expectations of what old growth was. Some of them were highly romantic and some of them were very pejorative. But we came that close to losing the old growth forest, this precious natural heritage, almost didn't make it.
So in addition to these old growth forest habitats as being important for other organisms, other living things, I think they're also important for human beings. They remind us of what our very planet can be when we leave it alone. There is a soulful beauty in these places. Perhaps we've cut too many of these forests, and we should let some of them recover and become old growth once again. And that's the beauty of the forest ecosystem. It can recover if we leave it alone. So in order to help speak for these forests, to make sure they remain preserved, and to allow other forests to recover old growth characteristics, I created an organization called the Old Growth Forest Network. And our vision is to have at least one forest in each county of the US where forests can grow that will be protected from logging and open to the public.
Thinking in terms of old growth forests across the spectrum of interests and values, one that strikes me is very important is its impact and value to the human spirit. People who go to these old growth sites are almost always impressed. Some are transformed. It's clear to me that within our evolutionary path, that nature was an absolute base of our understanding and experience. And this gives people who grew up far removed from forests a sense of what the majesty of the forest is really all about. It has that value along with ecology, ecological values, and let's say carbon sequestration. We can go down a long shopping list, but I wouldn't want to underplay its importance to the human spirit.